Okay, thank you very much for coming out this afternoon. I know there's a lot of interest in the circumstances of 3 Australian men who are currently on a Japanese vessel. I do need to tell you, I'm happy to answer all of your questions. I can't provide you with an update that's in advance of a number of the comments that I've been making throughout the course of today. Obviously, this is now primarily a diplomatic issue. We have made a number of representations very firmly to the Japanese government. We have been in consular contact with the 3 men's families, and DFAT will continue to be in close contact with them. Our primary concern now, of course, is for the health and well-being of those 3 Australian men, but the legal options available to Australia are limited when this action occurred outside our territorial waters. But we are certainly as determined as ever to put an end to whaling. We will pursue our action in the International Court of Justice, as we have made very clear we intend to continue with, and we think that will be ultimately the way that we can end whaling once and for all. In the interim, of course, we will continue to work with the Japanese government to ensure the safety of these 3 men. I'm happy to take any of your questions.
Do you know where the boat is?
No, we know that the boat and this particular incident occurred outside our territorial waters. We're not, and any vessel is not required to give us the details of their particular vessel at any time. Of course, we are conscious in our discussions with the Japanese officials that we want to know where the boat is. We haven't been advised whether the intention is for this vessel to return to Japan, to return to the Southern Ocean, or, as is our hope, to not particularly move too far away from Australia if provision can be made for these 3 men to be returned to Australian control.
Is there any indication on how they are being treated on the boat?
We certainly, when this becomes a consular matter, that's our first priority, to see if they are in good health and if they're being held in appropriate conditions. We've asked to be able to speak directly to the 3 men. That's, again, standard procedure for consular matters. That hasn't yet happened, but we certainly will be pursuing that.
Is there any sort of law as to how long they can be held without charge?
There's not a law that says it's a certain number of days. Of course, there are international standards that apply that if you're going to hold someone before they're charged or without them being brought before a court, that it should be a reasonable period of time. Unfortunately, that means people might argue over what is reasonable in the particular circumstances of boarding a ship in open seas. We certainly are urging the Japanese government to use all of their authority to bring this to a head quickly. We believe it would be in everyone's interest for these 3 men to be released back into Australian control, and we certainly will be exploring those options.
Have you been in contact with the Sea Shepherd? Is the Sea Shepherd still trailing the boat?
I haven't been in contact with the Sea Shepherd. Obviously, they're making a lot of their commentary publicly. I imagine that both ships are going to be keeping an eye on each other for some time. Of course, there are constraints. We don't allow into Australian ports any whaling vessels, and I think arguably, although this vessel is not directly involved in whaling, it is supporting other vessels that are. So there would be an argument about authority needing to be sought if it was going to come into an Australian port.
So would you describe the Japanese advice as uncooperative, given that 36 hours on, they're still not telling you where these guys are?
No, I wouldn't use those words. Obviously, we are very keen to have a constructive and open dialogue with the Japanese officials. All of you will understand that in these circumstances where there are strong views and heated passions involved, that actually making sure we do this in a sensible and careful and considered diplomatic way is important. I mean, I've heard Mr Abbott out there with all sorts of chest beating. Ultimately, this is not a time for sort of macho behaviour. It's a time for us to have some careful and considered diplomatic effort, and for us to continue with our well thought out legal strategy of taking this matter to the international courts.
What are the Japanese telling you? They're not telling you where the boat is?
Well, there is engagement between our officials from Foreign Affairs and theirs. We are discussing with them, of course, where the vessel is, what arrangements might be able to be made for these 3 men. As I understand it, the last information that we have received is that they have been being questioned. Of course, I imagine that consideration, excuse me, there's a bit of wind out here, I imagine that consideration is being given whether or not charges will be laid. Obviously, in this time climate is sensitive, and I think the priority that the Australian community would expect us to have is to make sure that we can do what we can for these 3 men to be released back into Australian custody, to make sure, or put back on Australian soil or an Australian vessel, and to make sure that they are in a healthy condition and are well.
Is it concerning that you haven't had contact with those men yet?
Often this sort of consular contact does take some time. We need to remember that these people are not on land in a known and easily identifiable place. It's not surprising that when you board a ship without having been invited to, that you might find that the people on that ship want to question you and want to understand what your intentions are. We're doing the best we can. This may not be a situation where hour by hour we'll have a development that we can provide to you. We will happily make ourselves available, but it does mean that on each and every occasion we might not have a progress report that meets all of your best wishes.
What are your legal options?
Well, we're considering a range of different options, but I need to be frank with you and the Australian public that the legal options are quite limited when this occurs outside Australian territory and outside territorial waters. We can't simply enforce our will upon a boat which is flagged to another nation and was not in our territorial waters. I understand the passions that are at stake here. Many millions of Australians want whaling to stop. But if people take the law into their own hands, there are consequences for doing that. And I think we're seeing some of those playing out. We now need to work with Japan to call for their support and understanding in a broader political issue where we do not agree with each other, but where the interests of these 3 Australian men are obviously at issue. And we will keep pursuing all options. And I'm continuing to get advice both from our international lawyers and, of course, my own department if there are any other options available to us.
There's a bit of criticism that these men knowingly broke the law and that they should only receive normal consular assistance. What constitutes normal consular assistance in this situation?
Well, normal consular assistance, of course, does include the sorts of things we were discussing before: access to make sure that people are being held in appropriate conditions, that their safety and well-being is being cared for, of course, that it not be for an unreasonable length of time before people are charged, if they are to be charged. Those sorts of questions and issues are all now being pursued. I do need to emphasise that these people are activists. They're committed to their particular cause. They would have been well advised and they would have taken this action with their eyes open. That doesn't stop us from wanting to make sure that they are being held in appropriate conditions and to working with the Japanese government for their early release. But I don't think these are 3 people who are unwittingly caught in this situation. They've done this intentionally and they are raising a focus on an issue that is of concern to many Australians, and that is ways to try to cease Japanese whaling in the Southern Ocean.
Does normal consular assistance include extrication and repatriation at the public's cost?
Well, I think you're getting a little bit ahead of where the government is up to. The government is making sure that our top priority is their safety and well-being. We want to make contact with them and to be able to make an assessment ourselves about their health and safety and their well-being. We do want to work with the Japanese government to talk about options for their return to Australia or to Australian control or an Australian vessel, and we will continue with those options.
Just one quick one on a customs vessel. The opposition and the Greens are both saying a customs vessel should, in future and now, be put out to monitor these events. Why does the government do that?
Well, we've made very clear the reason that we've previously sent a boat to monitor this sort of action, and that was to gather evidence for our international litigation. We've gathered that evidence. We don't need to do that again. It was the basis of a lot of material that's been put before the International Court. Again, I don't think this is the time for macho chest beating. Mr Abbott was part of a government that never sent a ship down to the Southern Ocean to keep an eye on things. This is not the role. We are not a military or paramilitary vigilante group. We will pursue action that's within the law, and we will take careful and considered action. This is a time for cool heads, not for macho chest beating.
But wouldn't you have more information right now if you had an Australian vessel observing what's going on out there?
I don't think that is necessarily the best use of Australian vessels. We obviously have responsibilities to monitor fishing. We have responsibilities for a whole range of other things. We are not going to, for example, we received a request from the Japanese government to send a vessel in the same way that we've received a request now, ironically, from Mr Abbott and from the Greens. We are not going to provide more support to whaling that we don't believe should be occurring and provide extra, what some people might view as protection. That's not the role of a customs boat. We don't have an intention to send it there, and I think this is time now for cooler heads and for considered action, which might actually ultimately bring an end to this whaling process.
Briefly on the issue of the breast implant discussion, the TGA is saying that it's confident that only 0.4% of women have been affected. But is there a concern that that's relying on voluntary reporting, and should there be further checks?
Well, absolutely the sort of information that is available relies on people reporting particular incidences to them. The TGA has been working very closely, not just with practitioners and women here in Australia, but also with their international counterparts. We do believe that more information will become available when there will be a number of women who will have these breast implants removed. If we get any additional data, we of course then will provide that to the public, and the TGA will keep considering its advice.
Do you believe there should be urgent compulsory testing of women affected by the implant?
No, look, the advice that we have currently is that there is no need for there to be urgent testing, that Australian women don't need to be unnecessarily concerned. We do think that Australian women should prioritise, if they have a breast implant, making sure they find out which type of implant it is. If it is a PIP implant, it is important to get some advice from your health professional about what is the best for you in your circumstances. The government is very wary and very reluctant of providing broad advice when each person's individual situation, particularly what another piece of surgery, the impact that might have on any particular woman, needs to be discussed with their health professional.